Russian trolls are trying to influence the 2016 US election. So did Putin's keyboard warriors really propel Donald Trump into the White House? Well, welcome to The Rest is Classified. I'm Gordon Carrera.
And I'm David McCloskey.
And David, in our last few episodes, we've been looking at the GRU, Russian military intelligence's hack of emails and then their leak through the summer of 2016 onto the internet. But that wasn't all that was going on, was it?
No, there was another plank, Gordon, in this active measure, another psyop that was focused on disinformation and in particular spreading disinformation on social media. It was led, Gordon, by friend of the pod, Yevgeny Prigozhin, chef turned warlord. And we made the comparison, Gordon, that Yevgeny Prigozhin is really what would have become of Chef Gordon Ramsay had Mr. Ramsay been brought up in sort of the twilight years of the Soviet Union and had been pulled into Vladimir Putin's orbit.
And then gone to lead a mercenary group and lead a march against his own government with a bunch of mercenaries before being blown up in an airplane. So
that's true.
The analogy doesn't entirely work.
No.
I think there are points at which the chef analogy breaks down, but there are some relevant points to it, I think. But let's be honest, they're limited.
He was Putin's caterer for a period. He ends up becoming a mercenary warlord running the Wagner Group.
He's this extraordinary figure who's on the criminal fringes in St. Petersburg in the 80s and then the 90s, opens up restaurants, hence he's becomes known as a chef. He's more of a restaurateur, really. But restaurants where the St. Petersburg elite starts to move, including Vladimir Putin. And that moves him by the end of the 90s into Putin's orbit as Putin comes to power in Moscow. And he starts catering to the guests of Vladimir Putin, including people like President Bush, Tony Blair. All the world leaders get their food served at dinner by Prigozhin and his team. But what's interesting is he also starts to move into the edges of politics through the 2000s. And the transition was really interesting because he got really involved in social media, initially because he was battling his critics when it came to restaurants and the restaurant world. He built up a network around him which did investigating journalists, paying off journalists, and then increasingly moving on to social media. That got noticed by the Kremlin around 2012 because, of course, the Kremlin, I think it's fair to say, the old security kind of guard around Putin were not internet natives.
They weren't so online.
They were not. They weren't so online. And, you can see them going, what is this new world of social media and, Twitter at the time and Facebook? And they have no idea about it. But they can see that Prigozhin has built this PR machine to bolster his own reputation. And it looks like the Kremlin around 2012 says to him, we could use that. We could use your PR machine for the purposes of bolstering the Kremlin. And so that leads around 2013 to the creation of this thing called the Internet Research Agency.
The IRA.
The IRA, distinguished from the Irish Republican Army.
I was told in my notes to not use that abbreviation so regularly
I
in
think
this episode.
It'll get very confusing otherwise. But the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, we should say, is in St. Petersburg, initially is a domestic social media influence organization, trying to influence and do campaigns within Russia to bolster support for Putin. Then by about 2014, it's going to start doing campaigns about Ukraine. But then, interestingly enough, at this point, 2014-15, it's going to start to set its eyes on America, isn't it?
This episode is sponsored by HP. Most people are not counter-espionage experts, but that won't stop them getting targeted by cyber criminals seeking to extract their secrets.
HP understands that approximately 4 in 10 UK businesses have reported cyber breaches in the past 12 months alone. That's why HP business laptops, desktops, and workstations bought directly on HP Store are secure straight out of the box with their endpoint security.
No more stressing about dodgy emails or unexplained pop-ups. HP's independently verified Wolf Pro security works alongside your existing security tools to protect your business users and reputation from malware and evolving cyber threats with your first click.
You don't need an alias or a secret hideout to stay safe. Just Wolf Pro security working tirelessly to protect your hard work. It's security that's built in not bolted on.
Find out more about how HP can protect your business at hp.com/classified. Podcast listeners benefit from a 10% discount on all business PCs, printers, and accessories using the code TRIC10. Terms and conditions apply.
And the mechanism for that is going to be something that they call the Translator Project, which is going to focus specifically on the US population and work across social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. This group will eventually have more than 80 employees assigned to it. So this is another feature of the way Prigozhin intervenes. This is pretty labor intensive, I think, in many ways. This is kind of pre-AI, so this is individual humans having to do a lot of this work. And interestingly, I mean, the month after the Translator Project is stood up back in 2014, the team is beginning discussions on how to interfere in the 2016 US election, which is still 2.5 years away. I guess you could say that one of the major advantages that Prigozhin has is that his team can create identities and just pose as Americans. So in a way, if we talk about kind of old school active measures where you had to seed an idea, an argument, misinformation, whatever it is, to a journalist and get them to then promulgate that idea or inject it into the bloodstream of whatever your target country is. In this case, what Prigozhin and his team can actually do is they can be the source themselves, posing as Americans and doing it digitally, online, and at scale.
Yeah, and that is the key difference. As the joke goes on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. No one knows you're a Russian on the internet. You can look like an American. And, in the old days with those active measures, they would have to work through multiple proxies and steps and chains to kind of launder the fact they were Russian. So maybe if you were the Russians, you'd approach an agent of yours who was an Italian, who happened to be a communist, who you could use to push out some of the information and push it forward. Here, these people in St. Petersburg, which gets called a troll factory, internet trolls, can just create in a few moments online an American identity and look to all intents and purposes, at least in the online space, as an American. It's one of those areas where the internet and modern technology transforms the potential of active measures.
We should say a little bit about the people who are staffing these trolls, because I think that they are not Pop-Tart eating hackers, right?
No.
Like the GRU has. These are kind of professional staff that are being hired for what really feels, as we'll get into it, like terrible, terrible, terrible work to have. And yet they're paid pretty well. They are, sort of young professionals, I guess you could say. It's got an office set up, right? There's several departments in the troll den, and apparently early on they printed the titles of the departments on A4 paper and taped them up on windowless offices. So there's a creative department, a rapid response department, a department each for commentators, bloggers, social media specialists. There's also another office in Moscow. Now, morale is low early on, and I think continuing, this will be a theme. A reporter who was able to infiltrate the Internet Research Agency and ask some of these employees questions. One of the employees said, "You could go crazy." They had to write 4 posts on a large Russian blogging platform per day, along with comments on internet forums, basically blast all these legitimate news stories with, crazy comments. It's all really tedious. It's all labor intensive. And it's all happening in this kind of drab gray building in St. Petersburg. Now, I think one of the other pieces of this that is interesting is you look at the kind of architecture of the active measure. I think that the GRU and the SVR kind of didn't want anything to do with this work. And a lot of this feels like there's not a connection between what Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency are doing and what the GRU is doing.
Yeah, and I think at the time, or when some of this first started to come out, people thought there was some master plan in which every bit of the Russian state was coordinated and doing different elements of this in conjunction with each other. And I think that's not the reality. I think the reality of the way the Kremlin works is there will be a view from the top that Putin wants this. The order will be given. We want to interfere with the election in this way. And then lots of people will go out and to some extent do it separately in their own silo and even compete to do things. And we saw that in the previous episodes when we saw how the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Agency, and the GRU, the Military Intelligence Agency, were both inside the DNC emails separately, doing different things. I don't think there is a particularly coordinated campaign other than the sense that this comes from the top, that this is what the boss wants, the boss being Putin.
And the GRU did have some social media kind of trolling that they had attempted during the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 when Russia had annexed Crimea. And it hadn't gone that well. And so I think in part, Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency, their work after Crimea and Ukraine in 2014 and in the run-up to the U.S. election, I think one of the aspects of Prigozhin's personality that really carried through in the series we did on him was that he's always looking for an opportunity.
He's entrepreneurial. Yeah.
He's very entrepreneurial. And he's looking for opportunities in some of the seams where the state agencies themselves are not effective or not working. And in this case, he may have taken up the kind of social media trolling piece of this, kind of seeing a gap, frankly, in what the intelligence agencies were up to in a way to demonstrate his value to Putin and the Kremlin.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Because I think the reality is, as we'd said on the US side, I don't think intelligence agencies, particularly this time, understood social media. I mean, I remember talking to people who work for intelligence agencies who were supposed to be thinking about, information warfare, what the Russians were up to. And they didn't have social media, because they were spies or they worked in the intelligence community. So particularly around this time, I think it was all quite alien to a lot of people in intelligence agencies, whether it's the GRU or whether it's the CIA or NSA, how social media worked. So you need someone like Prigozhin who can have people who can go out and understand social media, are natives to it, and also can go and learn about the US, because that's one of the aspects about it. If you're going to craft messages that are going to work on social media, you need to understand the audience you're trying to reach. And those Pop-Tart eating guys in the GRU don't understand that. But actually, what's interesting is the Internet Research Agency people, precisely because they're not spies, they go and travel to the United States, which is so interesting, to do the research, to work out how to have an impact.
So a team of 4 Internet Research Agency employees apply for visas to go to the U.S. Only 2 visas are granted. So 2 women working for Prigozhin travel for 3 weeks around the U.S. And I bet they had a very lovely time. They went to Nevada, California, New Mexico, Colorado, Illinois, Michigan, Louisiana, Texas, and New York in order to learn more about the U.S., to take pictures that they could use in their social media reports. And then they file a briefing, an internal report into up the chain of the Internet Research Agency after they return. And there's this great story on the heels of that trip, Gordon, where in the spring of 2015, one of the things the Internet Research Agency is trying to do is just figure out if they can actually arrange remotely via social media. Can they arrange an actual gathering of physical humans in the United States? And so they put out a Facebook post announcing a hot dog giveaway in New York City. There's a webcam they've arranged to have there to record it. And the pitch is basically show up here and get free hot dogs. And the webcam records a few New Yorkers actually showing up, looking around, looking puzzled, looking at their phones. When it reverberates back in St. Petersburg, the Internet Research Agency trolls are like ecstatic, hugging each other, crying, because they've been able to demonstrate that they could get like 7 New Yorkers to show up with the promise of free hot dogs. And we should say, I think, again, very much a theme of the Internet Research Agency effort, they are scoring themselves on inputs, not outcomes. Okay, that's going to be really important. Is okay, we got a few people to show up thinking they were going to have a hot dog. That's a big win. A lot of this stuff ends up getting packaged and sold up the chain in Moscow as great victories, when in fact it's sort of just activity, right? It's not an actual result.
But it is wild when you stand back and you think that getting people to turn up for a non-existent hot dog giveaway, this is not spying as we used to know it or think about it, is it?
The staff who work in the Internet Research Agency, this kind of translator project that's looking at the States, again, just kind of a further portrait that these are not the Pop-Tart eaters over at the GRU. They're pretty young. There's a great description of them as, hipsters kind of taking smoking breaks, wearing stylish haircuts, having beards, which are apparently, some part of his sort of hipster culture in Russia. It's very clear, though, right, that the goal of this effort, hot dogs and all, is to spread distrust toward the candidates, the American presidential candidates, and the political system in general. So the election really is a core focus area for Prigozhin and his trolls right away. The head of the America department is a 27-year-old named Yevgeny Prigozhin. He is an Azerbaijan-born guy who's apparently nicknamed Jay-Z, which I think is just wonderful. According to one former coworker, Aslanov, Jay-Z, was more popular as a colleague than as a boss. He was, quote, a great guy, but frankly speaking, generally incompetent as a manager. So we've got really the crack team here in St. Petersburg. Now, Jay-Z has a budget of approximately $1 million a year. Cue the Dr. Evil $1 million. Now, the trolls, which I also feel like this term is really, it's very derogatory toward
pejorative. Yeah,
bearded hipsters in St. Petersburg who are attempting to sabotage our presidential election. They are paid bonuses on audience engagement and reactions in the U.S. So I would argue that this creates massive incentives for bullshit. Now, the Internet Research Agency by 2016 had bought computing infrastructure and servers in the U.S. They purchased space on the servers and set up dedicated VPNs to be able to route traffic into the U.S. and make it look like it was coming from the U.S. And that tactic made it harder for social media companies in the States to actually uncover what was Russian disinformation operations on their platforms. By the time we get into summer, fall of 2016, so as the election is going, the Troll Factory's audience online had grown to hundreds of thousands of direct followers. And I will note again, we'll use some large numbers in this section, but we are not trying to claim here. I think we should probably say this right up front, that these numbers are not going to end up becoming particularly impressive when we talk about what actually happened, right? But the point is that there were a lot of Americans who were exposed in some way, shape, or form to what the Internet Research Agency was up to. I would say that the managers, Gordon, inside Prigozhin's shop, Jay-Z and his friends, were operating, even after that little trip that their friends took to the U.S., they were operating with some pretty rough and bizarre assumptions about what was actually going on in the U.S. So, for example, they decided that infographics worked better with liberals than with conservatives. They also decided that liberals were more active at night while conservatives got up earlier in the morning. I'm not sure if that's
sweeping statements. Yeah, I'm not sure it's true. It's just sweeping statements. But yes, doesn't seem like they've done that much research, but there you go.
And the basic strategy was that they would create personas that impersonated activists or sometimes organizations, and then boost those through paid ads to grow their following. And as many potential sort of or aspiring influencers will discover, it can be kind of hard. It can be long, tedious work to build an audience.
Tell me about it, David. It's in my Instagram feed.
As evidenced by Gordon Carrera's Instagram feed.
703 followers, I'm being told.
Gordon has 703.
And some of them are probably bots.
Some of them are probably bots. They're mostly... Gordon has bought nearly all of his 703 followers.
Exactly.
Yeah. If Prigozhin were still around, you could hire him to kind of whip your social media profile into shape.
Let's get back from my social media feed to the Internet Research Agency's social media feeds. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because they're creating these personas, and I mean, they're quite targeted in what they're trying to do, which I think is interesting. And they try lots of different things. You know, some of them work, some don't. But you can see that one of the interesting areas is they, for instance, target certain communities. So we talked about liberals and conservatives, but they target black voters specifically, don't they? And they're essentially trying to send a message to them to say, don't bother voting. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really interesting because they're not saying vote for this candidate or vote for that candidate. There's an element in which they're just trying to suppress the vote and make people disillusioned with politics. That was one of the tactics they used, wasn't it?
It was. And I think, it's worth looking at potentially a particular persona, because the Internet Research Agency created someone named Crystal Johnson. They chose a picture of a young Black woman who appears to be in her early 20s. And by mid-2016, after some hard work by the bearded hipsters at the Internet Research Agency, the account had about 7,000 followers. So roughly 10 times the number of followers as Gordon Carrera's Instagram account. And Crystal's bio said, quote, "It is our responsibility to promote the positive things that happen in our communities." She's supposedly from Richmond, Virginia. In one of her more popular posts in June of 2016, she puts up a picture of the boxer Muhammad Ali and his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And she jokes that Muhammad Ali's star is the only one hanging on a wall, not for anyone to step on. Now, that post has more than 22,000 engagements, but as I just said, not political, and has no impact on the election. It is designed because the trolls understand this. Like, they're trying to build an audience for Crystal Johnson, right? There's another example. In late September of 2016, a Twitter account at Black to Live, it was one of the Internet Research Agency's most important fake Black activist accounts, that had a follower count of 11,200, but kind of mediocre engagement figures. The account accumulated fewer than 190,000 social interactions in about a year, and only 16 of the account's more than 2,600 posts during the run-up mentioned Hillary Clinton. Yeah, there's a lot of people who are kind of seeing this stuff, but
some of it's not political.
Most of what they're seeing is just not political at all.
It's audience building rather than political. Yeah,
that's right. Now, the Internet Research Agency, Jay-Z and his crew in St. Petersburg were probably more successful with some of their conservative personas, right? And their most successful English language social media account was trying to mimic the Tennessee GOP, the Grand Old Party, the Tennessee Republican Party. And by the end of September 2016, at 10_GOP had just under 36,000 followers, which,
that's more than me. I've got
it's way more than you. It's way more than me. It's way more than the rest is classified. So shame on all of the tens of thousands of people who are listening to our podcast who haven't gone and checked us out on Instagram or Twitter or TikTok,
or subscribed on YouTube.
Where is our bot army, Gordon? It should be there. We want a bot army. If you're listening to this, go to @RestIsClassified on Instagram and subscribe, please, because these numbers.
Worst sell. This is the worst sell.
This is a pity sell, because when we compare our followers to this troll farm, it's terrible.
Back to 2016 at Tennessee GOP. Yeah. 36,000 followers. And they get a lot of engagement.
The account generates 3.2 million shares in the year before the election. It's unknown exactly how many of those interactions are with actual Americans, but it's probably the majority. Among that account's top 10 pre-election posts on Twitter, 5 attempted to undermine the legitimacy of the outcome and flagged like voter fraud, right? And one post, for example, published just the day before the election, earned more than 10,000 engagements. And it said, "Wow, another proof of #voter fraud. Machine refuses to allow vote for Trump. Retweet because media will never report this." That obviously is bad, shame on the Russians.
Yeah.
But again, it is striking that there's just a bunch of, because I tend to think, we tell these stories and you think about Russian disinformation, you sort of think about some kind of evil mastermind sitting in a room somewhere, puppeteering the election or kind of reprogramming American minds. And the reality is there is basically a kind of factory-like vibe at the Internet Research Agency with all of our bearded hipster friends
churning it out.
Just churning it out, right? One worker said they needed 135 200-character tweets per shift. The workers on the different floors apparently don't talk much to each other. They only interact over smoke breaks and over lunch and coffee. So they're very isolated. And in a February 2018 interview with the Washington Post, so a couple years after the election, a former internet research agency employee said, I immediately felt like a character in the book 1984. The agency was a place where you have to write that white is black and black is white. Your first feeling when you ended up there was that you were in some kind of factory that turned lying, telling untruths into an industrial assembly line.
But the question is, what impact did they really have? There's always a figure which is cited by, I think, Facebook after the election, says that the Internet Research Agency the posts reached 126 million Americans. Now that sounds extraordinary and led people to go, wow, that's, nearly half of all Americans were reached by these posts. But it's not quite the same as saying it had an impact, is it?
No. And I think the bottom line up front here is that these efforts didn't have much of an impact, and only 8.4% of the Internet Research Agency's activity was election related at all. And the pieces that were mostly stayed very much within echo chambers and did not cross over into networks of undecided voters. That's a really important point, is a lot of this was, conservatives or Democrats amplifying stuff that they already heard and believed and saw elsewhere.
Which is unlikely to change someone's vote. It might increase the intensity of their view. And, you could have some second order effects, but it's definitely different from actually persuading someone. I mean, it's like the old joke about advertising. No one really knows how much what advertising works, or at least only half of it works. You just don't, it's very hard to measure what's reaching someone and what actually changes them.
There does seem to be evidence that in at least 2 cases, the Internet Research Agency was able to actually arrange in-person kind of rallies or events. And in one case, they paid a Republican political activist in Florida, and I don't think she knew who was paying them, but they paid her to dress up as Hillary Clinton, and this woman happily did. She had a blonde wig. She had an orange prison uniform that she bought at Goodwill, because you remember, of course, one of the kind of major MAGA chants during the election was to lock her up.
Lock her up.
Right. And this woman, when she's confronted with the fact that it's actually the Russians who had paid her and set this thing up, she said, well, I would have done it for Trump anyway, right? There's a lot of excitement around this, and Russians didn't have any part of that. This wasn't a trick for me. So I think, again, it's this idea that if anyone else had reached out and said, go ahead and do this, she would have done it, right? And she was already voting, and everyone who's showing up at that rally, they're already voting for Trump, presumably. So that's another piece of it. I think another slice is that we joked about this a little bit with the way that the Internet Research Agency employees were getting to know the target, right? There wasn't a lot of regional or cultural specialization, and it prevented, in other words, a lot of the trolls didn't know much of anything about the communities, the states that their personas were alleging to come from or out of.
Despite the road trip.
Despite sending 2 people on a road trip across the United States, somehow they weren't able to pass themselves off as natives of many of these states and communities, right? So one Internet Research Agency member he said, first you got to be a redneck from Kentucky, then you need to be a white guy from Minnesota. That's actually me, Gordon. I'm a white guy from Minnesota. And then 15 minutes later, you're from New York, posting in some black slang. That's what this guy said. So it's like, yeah, you probably are going to struggle as a Russian in St. Petersburg who's just on this assembly line to really kind of write copy for your accounts that's going to be credible, right? And that other people are going to want to interact with, right? The other piece of this is that there were about 1 billion tweets related to the campaigns and that were posted in the 15 months leading up to the election.
By everyone, you mean? Yeah.
By everybody. Yeah. The Internet Research Agency generated less than 0.05% of all election-related posts, which when I read that, I'm kind of like, that's a small number. Then I thought, it's actually not an insignificant number for one operation in St. Petersburg, Russia. But the point is that it was absolutely drowned out by the organic tweets created by Americans during the election. Now, The House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence released about 2,300 of the Facebook ads that the trolls had placed over the 2 years preceding the election. And the top 10 most popular ads, which accounted for a quarter of all views, none of them had sharp or corrosive disinformation in them. So again, it's all kind of trying to drive people to these personas to build their profile. Now, the best known, the most widely covered Facebook ad depicted Satan in an arm wrestling match with a white-robed Jesus. And the caption says, Satan is saying, if I win, Clinton wins. And Jesus says, not if I can help it. The New York Times reported on and reproduced that ad after the election, and which obviously is, it's
famous. It's iconic. It's one of the more famous ones.
The original ad was one of the Internet Research Agency's least successful. It displayed for one day. It cost them 64 rubles, which at that point was $1, and it had 71 impressions, which is probably about the same number of impressions that you're getting on some of your Instagram posts, Gordon.
So I was going to say, I'd be pretty happy with that.
14 Americans clicked on it in total.
And yet that becomes the iconic one, which everyone points to, and it's on the New York Times and everywhere else. I think it's a really good example about how outsized the media reporting of it was compared to the potential actual impact of it, which isn't to say that it's meaningless, but it's just, I think that perspective is important.
That's right. I mean, the median number of impressions for all of the pre-election political ads thrown out there by the Internet Research Agency, the median number of impressions was 199. And impressions is literally, I looked at it. I scrolled past it, right? I didn't actually read or engage with it. So
yeah, it doesn't mean it did anything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do think what's interesting is the legacy of this operation will be enormous because for particularly in the long term, the press coverage of it, the questions around, was there targeting through kind of social media and through, remember the whole Cambridge Analytica thing and, the ability to manipulate people. It became a real thing and a real obsession. And that arguably overstates the impact of it and creates this sense that the Russians are there and almost all powerful and have the ability to manipulate American politics. And it's an active measure which, even if it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the election, on people's views, but it does have a much longer tail in terms of the kind of cultural, social, and political impact after the election. I think there's an interesting dichotomy there, isn't there?
And I think it's worth summing up that this piece of the Russian sort of disorganized active measure, right, the siloed active measure, this was, I think, the least effective component of what the Russians did in 2016. But the hack and leak,
it's much more significant.
The GRU hack and leak is much more significant. And by October of 2016, the Trump campaign is beginning to signal that another dump of information is coming, right? That the hack and leak is really, unlike the social media piece, is going to be really integrated into the kind of the TikTok, the chronology of events in the run up to the election. And of course, once again, Gordon, it's Roger Stone, Trump sort of campaign advisor, who is in the middle of the chaos, because on Sunday, October 2nd at 12:52 a.m., he's tweeting, and he tweets, Wednesday at Hillary Clinton is done, #WikiLeaks. So again, we have Roger Stone's got this weird foreknowledge of what Julian Assange is up to. Then later that day, Stone appears on the show of InfoWars conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, and Stone says, I'm assured the mother lode is coming on Wednesday. Says the release will be devastating. Also says that Assange was scared that the globalists and the Clintonites are trying to figure out how to kill him. It's quite fun. And then he puts out more tweets on the 3rd of October saying that the payload is coming. Right now, the following day, Stone is contacted by a senior Trump campaign official who wants to know what on earth WikiLeaks is planning. And Stone writes back that Julian Assange is going to release a load every week going forward. Meanwhile, as this tranche of new WikiLeaks data is about to come out, the intelligence community in the U.S. has had a task force running to try to build really a consensus view on exactly what is happening with respect to Russian interference. and why. And I should say, Gordon, that what they're producing is what's called an intelligence community assessment, and they want it to be a view of the entirety of the U.S. intelligence community. Now, I should say I have participated in the drafting of such papers, and I would struggle to identify a more miserable process that I was involved in government, because the reality of how these things are ultimately constructed is that you have representatives of the 17 or so intelligence agencies who will sit in a room and go through individual line edits and argue about particular words. And it is excruciating. It takes hours and hours and hours of time. The people from individual teams that are kind of voluntold, view it as sort of like an absolute nightmare. And it's the only time during my CIA tenure where I actually saw an adult human fall asleep in a meeting and no one bothered to wake them up.
You're destroying everyone's image of the exciting life inside the US intelligence community. It's certainly not Jason Bourne if people are falling asleep at meetings going through the drafting process for an intelligence community assessment. But I think the UK equivalent is the Joint Intelligence Committee, where they do JIC reports. And again, people really get into the language and are very precise, aren't they, about how strongly you're affirming a conclusion or coming to it. And, different agencies also like to kind of leave their stamp on it and argue about it. So the risk is it gets watered down to something a bit anodyne. But I guess this one was a big one and a sensitive one. And we talked previously, hadn't we, that they'd had some insight into what Russia was doing from a couple of sources, maybe an agent inside the Kremlin. And they've got intercepts, no doubt. And all of this is going to give them a bit of a picture as to what the Russians might be up to.
Well, and there is some new intelligence that has come in. And it seems that it's actual intercepts that came out after WikiLeaks had dumped the DNC emails. And on these intercepts, officials inside the Kremlin are congratulating themselves on a job well done. And one Russian official apparently referred to the operation having been done, quote, at the direction of our leadership. Mm-hmm. You see this kind of connection between the WikiLeaks dump and the Russian active measure that is demonstrated in the intelligence. Now, one sentence in particular is debated in these task force meetings, which is the sentence stating that Putin had authorized the operation. I'm assuming, based on how they understood the Russian government to operate, that they would have all believed that Vladimir Putin had personally authorized the operation, given that it's an authoritarian intelligence state and he sits at the head of it. But there's concern about actually naming Putin as the kind of mastermind of this in an official intelligence assessment, because some of those judgments, the high-level judgments in these intelligence assessments, are often declassified. And again, you come back to what we talked about in earlier episodes, the Obama administration not wanting to poke Putin for fear that he might do something more extreme against the actual election infrastructure, right? So they decide to scrap Putin's name from the intelligence community assessment, and ultimately from the sort of public statement that will be made about the findings inside that intelligence assessment. And they opt for the less specific wording of, quote, senior Kremlin officials, which you kind of don't know how that could mean anyone other than Putin, but it doesn't say his name. Now, the final draft is produced. It's got all the logos of all the intelligence agencies in the U.S. intelligence community, FBI, NSA, CIA, others, right? They all agree on this finding. But in the final principles meeting, the FBI director, James Comey, says he doesn't want the FBI's name attached to the statement. Something I find quite curious, actually. I'm not quite sure if this connects to some of the investigations the FBI has ongoing at this point in time into members of the Trump campaign, or what it really reflects on Comey's part. But it's a little bit curious.
Yeah, it is a bit curious. Maybe Comey's designed not to appear political. I mean, it's always a little odd, isn't it, with the FBI, because it's obviously got its law enforcement functions and it's got its counterintelligence functions. And sometimes it feels those two different responsibilities sit a little bit uneasily together. And I guess maybe that's an example of some of the tension of it. Hard to know.
So it's the 7th of October, 2016. This is going to be a very, very big day.
I can remember it.
And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is finishing the declassification of a statement based on the findings in this intelligence community assessment. Now, the U.S. government in modern times has never accused a foreign nation of intervening in the American political process, even though, as we mentioned in the first episode of the series, it had happened before. A public statement like this, I think, is without precedent.
It's a big deal.
And yet, this is barely going to make the news. So, October the 7th, Friday, 2016, it's 3:30 in the afternoon. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security issue a joint statement declaring that the intelligence community was, quote, confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromises of emails from U.S. persons and institutions, including from U.S. political organizations. And then it says that the release of all that stolen material by DC Leaks, which is the GRU front account, WikiLeaks, and Guccifer 2.0 was, quote, consistent with the methods and motivations of Russian-directed efforts. These thefts and disclosures are intended to interfere with the U.S. election process. And then it states, in kind of a, I think, indirect way, that, quote, only Russia's senior-most officials could have authorized these activities. Now, it also makes a statement about individual states seeing some scanning and probing of their election-related systems. The Clinton campaign is ecstatic about the statement. The Trump team, kind of meh. Not so much of a reaction.
For those of us following kind of national security, cybersecurity, it was a big deal, although it is going to be completely blown out of the water as a story. As you said, at 3:30 in the afternoon, that statement comes out. At 4 p.m., news comes out of what's called the Access Hollywood tape. And we should remind people who've maybe blanked this out of their minds what it was. But it was a recording of Donald Trump talking to the Access Hollywood host Billy Bush.
Trump essentially brags about kissing and groping and propositioning women without any kind of remorse.
And I think a lot of people, when that tape emerged, thought this was game over for Donald Trump. So you can see why at that moment, when that tape comes out, all this stuff about hacking and Russian stuff doesn't get the attention.
Although, in yet another strange, and I think we could argue about whether this is a coincidence or not. I'm actually not sure. At 4:32 p.m., so a half hour after the Access Hollywood tape comes out, WikiLeaks tweets, release the Podesta emails. And at that moment in time, WikiLeaks is posting about 2,000 of John Podesta's emails. Now, John Podesta, remember, is the chair of the Clinton campaign. I wondered, Gordon, as I was researching the story, if WikiLeaks did this in response, if they were already had it ready and they sort of accelerated the dump in order to try to distract from the Access Hollywood story, or if this is just another of these random coincidences that seems to strike on that day in October.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was a deliberate drop there to distract from both the intelligence community statement and Access Hollywood. Maybe it was coming anyway around then. That's what you'd have thought. But it's amazing how much happens in that one period of basically an hour or so on a Friday afternoon.
Now, we should talk a little bit about the Podesta emails, because a lot of it is actually really boring. So it's messages that John Podesta is like, I'm headed home, honey, for the night. I'm on my way. There's a risotto recipe in there. There were excerpts of Hillary Clinton's speeches to Wall Street firms that, for example, that she had made after she had left government as Obama's Secretary of State, and that she'd refused to release. There were exchanges, unsurprisingly, that exposed infighting among campaign aides. And there were some kind of cringy comments about Hillary, and in one that got a lot of traction. There's a former Clinton campaign advisor saying that, Clinton's instincts can be terrible, right? So kind of bashing the candidate. And whether it was planned or not, the hope on the part of WikiLeaks and, of course, the Trump campaign would be that it would draw some fire away from the Access Hollywood tape. Although we should say, I don't think it's really effective in doing that. I mean, the Access Hollywood tape consumes all of the all of the oxygen, right? That is the big story.
But the Clinton stuff continues to drip out, doesn't it? And I think that's the effect of it, is rather than dominating the news cycle that day, the Podesta emails, I suppose I should say, they drip out and people are looking through them and finding stuff. And they are going to play out through the kind of closing weeks of the campaign.
I would argue that just the constant drumbeat of the email stuff, it's going to be integrated into the final weeks of the campaign and injected into the bloodstream of the election. Because, for example, during the second presidential debate, Hillary Clinton is asked directly about the Podesta emails, right? So a debate question is generated from the kind of stew of a Russian active measure. And, Clinton's tries to focus on the Russian attacks and Trump deflects it. So the leaks to the kind of drip, 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 they come out in 34 tranches, just about one every day up until the election. There's a total of 64,000 emails that are released. And each tranche has some kind of enticing pieces of information to keep the story going and to make sure that journalists, pick it up, that news outlets pick it up. So for one example, there's an email where Clinton aides are tapping clients of their consulting firms for contributions to the Clinton Global Initiative, seemingly in exchange for access to former President Clinton. So there's one client, Coca-Cola, that receives a face-to-face meeting with the former president at his home back in 2009 after contributing millions to his nonprofit foundation, right? So there's stuff that comes out like this.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I think it played into the idea that Hillary Clinton was tight with Wall Street and with big business, and was not an advocate for working people, which was a kind of Trump's message was I'm for the ordinary people. And, she's part of the kind of globalist elite. And I think there were elements of that which worked. Also, some of the Podesta emails slamming Bernie Sanders, calling him a doofus, things like that may have had an impact.
I mean, Gordon, what I think is happening here is that the email stuff just blurs together in the minds of many Americans, right? Because the WikiLeaks dump, the Podesta emails, are a very separate issue from the private email server that Hillary had been using, that the Department of Justice had been investigating, and that had generated so much of the controversy about Hillary Clinton and emails.
They get conflated a little bit.
They get conflated, right? And so I think in a lot of the public mind, the stuff that's being released is the stuff that she was covering up, right? Those two things converge, I think, for many Americans, and it amplifies, I think, the impact of the Russian active measure. I mean, again, this is all kind of straight out of the active measures playbook, wouldn't you say, Gordon? I mean, you exploit these kind of weaknesses and existing controversy, muddy the waters. They're using journalists to amplify the message throughout the fall. I think it is interesting. Like, it was known that the GRU was behind the DNC hacks, and yet, because nobody, I think at that point, and even now, frankly, a lot of the connection between the GRU and WikiLeaks is still pretty murky. Exactly how and when the GRU got all this stuff to WikiLeaks and what WikiLeaks knew about what they had and where it had come from. So I think that piece of the story was sort of unexplored and impossible to explore back during the election cycle. And so the source for all of this stuff is not cited as the Russian GRU. The source is cited as WikiLeaks. And journalists are much more inclined, I think, obviously, to work or to cite stuff that WikiLeaks is putting out that they would have been if the source had been Russian intelligence.
After this, there's a lot of thinking in journalistic circles, which is, what are the ethics? What are the kind of practicalities of dealing with leaked information? Because, there's one way of looking at it, which is to go, well, the source of something doesn't matter if the information is true and is newsworthy and interesting. And there's another view, which is to say, but what if it is being released by someone with an agenda, and in this case, an intelligence agency trying to manipulate you? And I think it took time for journalists to kind of find their way around this and to understand how to deal with leaked information. I think it was all quite new. It became a long-running issue. Like, how do you deal with something which may be disinformation, may be true, may be pushed by another state, but be true? You know, when you get to the next campaign, you get to kind of Hunter Biden's laptop. There's a whole other story there, which some people don't cover because they think it's being pushed out by the Russians. But then what if it is true and they've ignored it because it becomes quite a contentious issue, I think, within journalism.
And then, Gordon, on the 31st of October, 2016, so 8 days before the election, we get another massive blending of this whole Hillary Clinton and email issue, because on the 31st of October, FBI Director James Comey announces the discovery of additional Clinton server emails that he says need to be reviewed. And this is an absolute bombshell.
I mean, I think there are a lot of people who actually think that it's this announcement of the James Comey investigation, of renewing, basically reopening an investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails 8 days before the election, that may be the thing that swings the election more than anything else. You know, James Comey's decision to do that and to be public about it is something I think he will be very, very heavily criticized for. There just becomes this morass of stories around Hillary Clinton leaked emails, just that sense that there's something murky, or as some might put it, crooked around Hillary. And that is part of the problem, which is going to be hanging over her like a cloud in those final days of the campaign.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because Comey at that point hasn't said anything about an investigation called Crossfire Hurricane, which is a look at Trump campaign associates and their linkages to Russia. And we go into much more detail on this in our mini-series for club members. But that's not public before the election.
And it's the problem that you've got him publicly announcing a new investigation to Hillary Clinton, but not revealing that they're investigating the Donald Trump campaign. You know, that I agree is, you know, in hindsight is a very big call. And that's putting it mildly.
So November 8th, 2016, it's election day, Gordon. What do you remember, by the way? What was the vibe in the UK when you got the news that Donald Trump had been elected?
I was in the US Embassy in London. The vibe is always quite kind of fun, and there's drinks, and there was an Elvis impersonator. I think I've got a picture of me with an Elvis impersonator from that night. But you can imagine that it's the US Embassy. Both the staff and most of the crowd at that time are definitely in the Hillary Clinton camp. No one was expecting a Donald Trump victory. And I just remember when the first results started to come in, and there were the initial exit polls and details, I think from Florida, which suggested it was going to be much closer than people thought. I mean, the mood just changed in an instant. And people just started to leave at that moment when they realized it wasn't going that way. I mean, the party basically ended. What about you?
I was at home and I'd been watching with family and friends, and then basically everyone had either left or gone to bed, under the presumption that it was going to be a Clinton victory. Because you remember that evening, it like went from, I mean, almost certain that it was going to be Clinton to she's done, right, in a matter of hours as the results came in.
It was
I remember
amazing.
going and actually waking my wife up to tell her that it completely swung the opposite direction from when she'd gone to bed. I mean, it was just, it was absolutely astounding. But so Trump wins. He gives a kind of weirdly gracious speech complimenting Hillary Clinton and the campaign. And in the days that follow, the U.S. Intelligence community is going to intercept communications among senior Russian officials in which they are congratulating themselves on Trump's victory. But we have our elections in November, and the new president is not inaugurated until January. And so Barack Obama is president for a few more months. And I think hanging over his head is a really big question, which is, you know, how or should you even retaliate against this active measure?
So, David, we are in the aftermath of that real shock of an election result in November 2016 when Donald Trump wins. President Obama has, as we've heard, been trying to avoid being seen to influence the election in any way, and probably been, like many people, assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to win. He's still in office. He's got a problem now. Some people might say a problem partly of his own making for not calling out earlier. But now what do you do? I mean, the election is done. Donald Trump is elected.
More statements, Gordon. More wagging of the stern statements, wagging of the finger at Moscow. I mean, there is a final warning that's conveyed to the Kremlin on the 31st of October through a secure channel that's actually originally designed to prevent miscommunication between Washington and Moscow leading to a nuclear exchange. And it's the red phone. And the late October message very carefully alludes to war. It notes that international law, including the law for armed conflict, applies to actions in cyberspace, and that meddling in the election would represent serious interference in the fundamentals of U.S. society. Russia confirms that it got the message, but offers no immediate reply. Now, I don't know how much of this is just, sort of wish casting, but Obama officials have since said that they think that those warnings a week before the election persuaded Putin to abandon any idea of actually carrying out a cyber offensive on election day.
We talked previously about the fact the Russians had got into some of the things like voter databases in states and some of that electoral infrastructure. And it is true that they didn't do anything. There's no sign of them really interfering with the actual voting process or the tallying or the registration on the day. So it is possible the warning did have an impact. It's hard to know, I guess.
And I think probably impossible to know. The Senate investigation back into 2016, the Mueller report, all of the journalistic work that's been done on this, there hasn't been anyone who has been able to say that the Russians manipulated vote counts or directly interfered in the actual electoral process. That did not happen. Yeah. And during 2016, that was a massive fear.
There was a view which was if Hillary Clinton had won, it might have been more in Russia's interest to suggest that the voting counts had been interfered with and to start spreading information at least. But they don't need to do that in the end. So again, there's different scenarios and possibilities here. But so much of it does seem to have been defined by the fact that everyone thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And I think that factor, that people were just convinced that Trump wouldn't win, I think does help understand what otherwise seem quite odd actions by a lot of the key players in this, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it from Obama's standpoint. He doesn't weigh in really on Russian interference publicly because he assumes Hillary will be elected. He doesn't want to taint the upcoming Clinton presidency. Obama also doesn't punish the Russians before the election because he assumes that once Hillary is elected, she'll be able to finish the job or be able to respond, at the beginning of her administration in a more forceful way. But of course, Hillary did not win. And we now have a new president-elect, Donald Trump, who's praised Putin and WikiLeaks throughout the campaign, encouraged them one moment in late July to intervene on his behalf, and has publicly said during the campaign, I think in one of the debates, that nobody knows whether Russia intervened in the election, right? So this kind of tough position that Barack Obama and his administration are in, it continues because, what do you do? I mean, if you're Obama, do you appoint a formal investigation? Obama nixes that. He's worried that's going to be too political. He launches another intelligence community review, and the CIA, other agencies, uncover some information that influences their view that Trump was Putin's preferred candidate. And details of this begin to leak out, I think, to the Washington Post almost immediately. And this is important because although the public had known for months that Russia had intervened, nobody knew that CIA believed that it was actually a formal intelligence assessment, right? That the intervention had occurred, the Russian intervention had occurred on behalf of Trump, which makes anybody getting involved in this in the weeks and months after the elections even more politically toxic.
I mean, that is the problem, because then immediately Donald Trump sees this as being an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of his win in the election. And therefore, this is really, I think, where you start to see the talk of the deep state really taking root with Donald Trump, because he comes to view this as a concerted attempt to smear and undermine his legitimacy by using accusations that he'd only been elected by the Russians now. But it is important, these leaks and reports and these intelligence community assessments, which are starting to come out in December and January, in actually defining the whole of the Trump presidency, the first and the second Trump presidency, in terms of how it sees the deep state, how it sees Russia, all of these big questions. I think a lot of them revolve around what's happening in these few weeks. And in the meantime, I mean, the US intelligence community is going to come to this assessment, but what are they going to do to the Russians? It's pretty weak, isn't it? If you think someone's interfered in an election, I mean, what do? They expel a few GRU and FSB officials from the US?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the final tally is there are additional sanctions placed on the GRU, the FSB, and 3 Russian intelligence officials, 4 companies involved in cyber operations. The U.S. expels 35 Russian, I guess they believe are Russian intelligence officers. Of course, a lot of them are all of them are under diplomatic cover. There are Russian diplomatic compounds in New York and Maryland that get shuttered, and the Russians are told they have 24 hours to vacate those properties and 72 to get the expelled officials out of the U.S. It's something, but it is pretty weak. Now, what is left unsaid here by the administration at the kind of public unveiling of these punishments is that it seems very likely that the president authorized the CIA, the NSA, and U.S. Cyber Command to deploy malware and implants in critical Russian networks. It could be telecoms, it could be electricity. And that's a long-term game. That's not something you do overnight.
To be honest, they should be doing that anyway. I kind of go, why were they not doing that anyway? You don't, that feels to me not either a punishment or a deterrence, to be honest, especially if it's secret. But I guess they're about to be out of office. I mean, there's a limit to what they can do. Their time is up.
Yeah, it comes down to what Trump is ultimately going to do about Russia and its interference in the 2016 election.
And that, as they say, is a very different story. One we're not going to deal with today, Trump, right, and how he deals with Russia after the election. I think we may come to that another time. But I guess we're left still with some pretty big questions, aren't we, David? Which is, what were the Russians trying to do with this active measure, and how much did it succeed?
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's three big questions to look at. The first one is, did Putin get what he wanted? The second one is, what impact, if any, did the active measure have on the outcome of the election? And the third, I think, is what impact did it have on U.S. institutions and the kind of broader society? And I think it's worth thinking about those three things separately. So let's start with the first one. Did Putin get what he wanted? Intelligence community assesses that Putin ordered an influence campaign aimed at the U.S. presidential election, that its goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, harm her electability and potential presidency. We further assess that Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump. We have high confidence in these judgments. And so I think you could say, in one word, yes.
Yeah.
Putin got what he wanted.
Yeah. I think if you run through it, undermined faith in the democratic process because people view it as subject to interference, denigrated Hillary Clinton. Yep. Made it harder for her to be elected. Yes. Although whether it swung the election, we'll come back to. But yes, I think you can argue that it was an active measure, which in that sense, if that was its objective, it worked. Even though, as I think we were suggesting all the way through, it perhaps was improvised. It wasn't necessarily all coordinated as one great master plan. There were bits of improvisation with some of the interactions with different officials, including in the Trump campaign. But I almost wonder if it succeeded more than they expected it to, because I don't think they expected Donald Trump to win. I think they just thought, let's just mess with this a bit.
I mean, I think Putin obviously decided and told his intelligence agencies early on that he wanted them to interfere in the election and to sow chaos in the U.S. The active measure was approved at the highest level. But as we've seen, none of his intelligence agencies really coordinated with one another. I think the Russians were responding as much to events in real time as maybe anybody else. And this was very, very improvised. So yes, Putin got what he wanted, but it wasn't a kind of well thought out evil master plan. I think the second question, though, Gord, this is maybe the big one. What impact did the active measure have on the outcome of the election? Now, first off, just to remind everyone, no evidence of direct tampering with election infrastructure. FBI forensic work that's been done in the years since has showed the Russians probed pretty much every state voting system, but there was no breakdown at the polling booths. There was no manipulation of vote counts. The CIA and the broader intelligence community, interestingly, and I think rightly so, the intelligence community has not taken a stand on this.
Yeah.
It is worth reminding everyone how close this election was. Trump lost the popular vote. He won 3 important states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, by, respectively, he won Michigan by 10,704 votes. He won Pennsylvania by 44,292 votes, and he won Wisconsin by 22,748 votes. That is a roughly 78,000 vote swing, and Hillary wins the election.
The fact that it's incredibly close could lead you to go, well, the Russians swung the election. But you could also say, when it's that close, lots of things can swing an election. I mean, you mentioned Wisconsin there. I mean, the fact is Hillary Clinton didn't bother campaigning in Wisconsin. I think she didn't go there. And there are a number of states where she didn't vote. So you could argue the decisions of the Hillary Clinton campaign were the things that cost her the election because it was that close. So when you've got a really close election, you can come up with lots of things which potentially could have swung it. I think you can definitely make the case that James Comey's decision to publicly announce he was reinvestigating her emails could have swung the election when it's that close. So I think it is always really hard. And I think if you look at the academic work as well, to understand why people make a decision to vote a particular way and what might have changed it and what made an impact. Did seeing one particular ad make them change their mind and vote a different way? Did a news report about Hillary Clinton's emails or John Podesta's emails make the difference? I think it's really, really hard to measure that. That is the problem.
That is the problem. And I do think that the analogy, the overall analogy that comes to mind for me is, if you have a really, really close, you could have a baseball game that is decided on the very last pitch, right? Whether that's a strike or it's a home run or it's whatever it is, like very last pitch. And there is a tendency in the way that you analyze these games and think about them to put a tremendous amount of weight on that thing that happened at the very end of the game. And yet, the result of the game comes down to the lineup of either team, decisions that are made about who plays where and when, at bats that happened much earlier in the game. To say that the game was won or lost solely because of that at bat is just not right. Yeah. Because it's the sum total of a whole bunch of other decisions and outcomes that happened beforehand. I do think it's interesting, though, because we've talked in this series about basically 2 planks to the active measure. There's the social media trolling that Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency led, and then there's the Hackett leak, which was conducted by the GRU. And I think it's interesting if you try to split those 2 apart to kind of look at, well, what impact, you're right, it's one factor among many, but kind of, was it a really big factor, or was it potentially a smaller factor in the outcome? And there's a book called Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President, What We Don't, Can't, and Do Know, written by an academic named Kathleen Hall Jameson, who did an interesting analysis of the social media, of really both of these planks, but she starts with the social media trolling. And she uses data scholarly work from the advertising industry to look at how exposure to messages affects decisions to buy things or to vote, right? And what she did was she looked at the total number of Americans exposed to the troll content and then kind of walked that down to the potential number of votes affected at the state level. And in the back of the envelope calculation that she did, even with those really large exposure numbers that we talked about in the last episode on what Yevgeny Prigozhin was up to, really minor impact on the vote, and even the really minor impact that she calculates on the vote is probably an overstatement of its impact. So the sort of the troll content,
the social media, the Facebook ads,
the social media content probably had almost no impact. But when you look at the hack and leak content
Yeah, I
that
agree.
was
More
supplied by
interesting.
the GRU, it is more interesting because it's massively covered in the press. It's searched by ordinary Americans in the campaign and election cycle. And, there's an argument that some have made that say, well, all of this content that the Russians injected into the American bloodstream through their WikiLeaks, like, it was just kind of jumped upon by the right-wing, kind of more pro-Trump propaganda bandwagon, right? That all of this stuff was really only being consumed inside Trump world. And that's really not true. I mean, as an example, from the 7th of October through the 20th of October, I mean, so really as we're getting into the kind of final days of the election, there were over 8,000 headlines that had the term WikiLeaks covered across over 300 outlets. There was an average of a piece and a half of content per outlet per day. Hashtag Podesta emails was trending on Twitter throughout October. And the stories were big. I mean, they were on the CBS Nightly News. They were on NPR Morning Edition. I mean, these are massive, particularly 10 years ago. I mean, at that point, NPR's Morning Edition was reaching like 15 million listeners. So there's a lot of agenda setting and kind of framing that the hacked content is able to do in the American media. And I think what is interesting is, like, if you look at the 538, which is a kind of polling, they aggregate polls, right, and do political and sports forecasting. And in their analysis, they looked and they said the percentage of Americans who found Hillary Clinton to be honest or trustworthy, it stayed at around 30% in polling throughout October and into November, right? Which initially on the face of it would say, this stuff didn't really have much of an impact. But the race in late October, which is the period where that Podesta content in particular was regularly framing the news cycle, and where you could see real spikes in interest by actual people in that content on Google Trends, in that period, the race is getting a lot tighter. And Clinton's lead over Trump, it peaks at 7 percentage points in polls on the 17th of October. Again, that's according to the 538 forecast. By late October, it's down to 5.7 percentage points. Other polls that are conducted in that same period have the margin at like 2 to 5 points. So there's a massive decline. Even before Comey's statement, there's a significant decline.
But what causes that? I think I find it very, very the correlation rather than causation to that and the WikiLeaks dumps.
It's the GRU hack and the WikiLeaks content, unlike the social media disinformation and trolling. I think was one of the factors that contributed to the outcome of the election. But how important or decisive it is, I think we just cannot know.
No, I agree.
In the end, the election is decided or comes down to a swing of 78,000 votes. And there are a lot more important factors than the GRU hack and WikiLeaks, which were the character of the candidates, their stances, the charisma the candidates had, and their strategies. So, for example, Hillary not campaigning in Wisconsin is arguably a more important piece of this overall story than the GRU hack ever was.
Actually, the one bit I always found slightly more convincing was the idea, I think I raised it in a previous episode, was that the release of the DNC emails on the eve of the convention in which the DNC was biased against Bernie, I think may have turned off some of those Bernie supporters from supporting Hillary and suppress some of the support that might have come with her there. You can make a case for that, but I agree with you. Ultimately, it's just very difficult to disentangle. So the third question that you raised was, what impact, if any, did it have on US institutions and the broader society? Now, this, I think, is the most interesting one, isn't it? Because this is where the legacy of it is incredible. I mean, active measures were about discrediting, dividing, sowing disunity. Boy, does the 2016 election do that, and does the question of whether the Russians swung the election or not do that. It's a second order effect in a way. It's not their posts on Facebook. It's the question of, did the Russians interfere in the US election? Does that delegitimize Donald Trump's election? What does it mean for that? All of that is enormous, I think.
It's interesting to look at the impact that this whole story had on the intelligence community in particular, right? Because the intelligence community throughout the story was sort of forced to make analytic calls on the active measure itself. And because the active measure was political in nature, and it involved collaboration, even in an indirect way, with the U.S. political system and people in it made the analytic calls that the agency and other members of the intelligence community had to make inherently political, or at least increased the possibility that they would be politicized or viewed as political in nature. And it became impossible as a result to assess what was happening without being perceived as weighing in favor of one candidate over the other. And because the CIA and the intelligence community more broadly are set up to collect on and to analyze the actions of foreign adversaries, and in this case, because a foreign adversary had a clear preference for one of the candidates, Trump, it meant that in effect the CIA couldn't do its job without appearing to favor Hillary Clinton. And there has also been a wave of either misguided or totally disingenuous disinformation that has persisted since, that has attempted to kind of create a picture that the CIA actually did weigh in favor of Hillary Clinton to diminish Trump. But what all this has done is the active measure in a lot of ways has fueled and created a very conspiratorial, partisan view of the intelligence community. And it's eroded trust in the U.S. intelligence system. And weirdly, this is one of the weird effects of it, Gordon, is like, when I worked at the CIA, I would say that we were sort of bashed more by the left, right? You look at the call on Iraq WMD, enhanced interrogation / torture, like the criticism of the agency, and a lot of the criticism of what the agency had been in the past really came from the American left, right? And what's so bizarre and topsy-turvy about the world we're in now after this active measure is that it's kind of flipped, right? And the CIA is critiqued much more by the kind of Trump right as being the deep state, as being advocates of Hillary Clinton, right? So it's actually made it a lot harder to understand what actually happened, because a significant section of the electorate just doesn't believe the actual analysis that the intelligence community is doing.
Yeah, that's right, because it's politicized intelligence in a completely new way, I think, for the US system. And at any time anyone wants to explore it, it immediately goes to that question of, are you questioning the legitimacy of the election? Are you, what's your agenda? You almost cannot get into this subject. I hope we've got into it without trying to be too partisan, but the risk is it immediately opens everything up to partisanship rather than an assessment of what the Russians might have been doing and trying to do, and how successful they were and what their methods were.
Yeah,
I think it's also seeded that idea that you don't know who you can trust on social media. You don't know who's trying to manipulate you. You don't know what secret agendas are being pushed, whether it's in social media, whether it's in news stories, whether it's in the latest hack, whether this is a false flag. There's this whole world of mistrust about information, and not just intelligence, but information and news, which I think is fed by 2016. There's deeper roots to it as well. People can go back to the Iraq and WMD and people feeling like they were fed false information then. But I think 2016 and the questions of whether there was manipulation just opens up the idea that there is not a neutral news or information space, but it's subject to interference by hostile states and actors who we don't always know about, or people claiming those are actors in order to discredit their opponents. All of that just muddies the water and creates some of the problems we've got these days.
Fundamentally, if the goal, and we talked about, there are a number of different goals that the Russians layer onto this as time goes on, but if fundamentally the goal is to sow chaos inside your adversary, what better way to do that than to make it impossible to know what's true?
Yeah.
And to feed that. And I think that is maybe one of the most lasting impacts of this, is that it has contributed to a general assault on truth and our ability as citizens to understand what's true and what's not, truly. And I think that is perhaps the most profound impact of this Russian active measure from 2016.
Yeah, that's right. Peter Pomerantsev wrote that great book about having worked in Russian media in the 1990s called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And it was about a kind of world out of which Prigozhin came, in which you could just make stuff up and get away with it because everyone had a kind of fragmented and unsteady view of truth. And you feel like that Russian worldview of the 1990s has increasingly been exported into the US and then to the West more broadly, including the UK. And part of that is the result of Russian active measures. And part of it is a kind of weird confluence of circumstances which occurred in that 2016 election. So it is whether or not it swung the election, that's almost there are bigger things which it certainly did, this Russian active measure. It is extraordinary, I think, to look at it and its legacy, isn't it?
It is. And I think, there's an interesting postscript to all this, Gordon, and I think maybe we close with this. Russia in 2024 intervened again in the presidential election. The Russians conducted at least 2 separate information campaigns, mostly spreading a lot of fabricated videos online. And there was a covert effort organized by the state television network RT and Russian intelligence to funnel at least $10 billion to prominent American political influencers. And influencers, of course, have said since that they had no idea the source of the money was Russia.
Exactly. And I think the reality is Russian active measures continue. And as that story reveals, is they've just changed their methods. They'll keep changing their methods and do different things. They won't do the same thing as last time. Let's not even get on to what the Russians might have done or not done in the Brexit referendum. That's like a whole other story. But
the last 2 minutes of our series, you bring up Brexit.
Brexit. It's time to bring up Brexit. But no, I think, that is the point. They've messed with our minds. And I think that is a slightly depressing way to end this series, which has given us a view of a Russian active measure, but a reminder that there's more for
We're running
members.
Our own active measure, Gordon. A reminder.
Our own active measures, spreading the truth rather than lies. The truth, where we're going to dive deep into the Trump campaign's relationship with Russia through 2016 and telling that story in fascinating detail, which is a real counterpart to the story we've been following on this podcast. So do sign up to the Declassified Club at therestisclassified.com to listen to that. But otherwise, David, we will hopefully see you next time.
We'll see you next time.